Well, hello. It's another Atomic Geekdom author interview, and we are back. I'm Matt, and Jenny is here, and we are back with one of our favorites. We are back with New York Times best-selling author of more titles than I can even begin to name, Jonathan Maberry, who is here to talk about the final book in the Kagen the Damned trilogy. The latest release just came out on the 20th of August, 2024. That is titled The Dragon in Winter. And so, Jonathan, welcome back. Always good to have you here.
Delighted to be back with you guys.
Yes, yes. So The Dragon in Winter, like I said, final Kagen the Damned book. And I gotta say, I finished it a little bit ago because I had another book I had to also hurry up and get read before. Interestingly enough, your book and this book came out the same day, and I was like, well, I got to read Kagen first. It's the larger book. I got to spend more time on it, so I finished it a little bit ago, and I really I was like, yeah, I'm in a fantasy mood now, which I haven't been. For a lot of I've never been like a big fantasy reader, but by the end of the Kagan series, I'm like, man, I need a little bit more of this in my life. So I think on that front, I can give away the fact that I thought it was really amazing. So
Delighted to hear that.
yeah,
This is the first interview I've done since the book came out, so
cool.
I'm very excited to hear what you guys think about it. And I certainly fell in love with it while I was writing it, which is not always the case with a novel. Some you write and you feel good about, and some you write and you absolutely love the book, the characters, the world, and so on, and you can't wait to get back to it each day. And that was the case with all three of the Kagan books. I found a new love in epic fantasy.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in too and sort of give all of the listeners a heads up is I don't know how to do this interview without a shit ton of spoilers. So I'm going to throw the spoiler alert out there right now.
That's fair.
But I want to start off and just saying as like a fan of this book, I'm similar to Matt, like fantasy is not the genre I usually dive into. It always has felt like for me growing up, fantasy is it's a heavy lift because you have to learn languages, you have to learn new lands, the rules of magic, and every fantasy I've ever read, the rules change each time. This one, each book, starting with the first, going into the Son of the Poison Rose, into this, there's a way that the fantasy's written that I want to credit you to that wasn't something that I'm used to is it's very action-based. The magic's there, the characters are there, the world building is very intense, but the way it's written it feels more modern than normal fantasy is. And this one in particular, you get reintroduced to your characters that you loved in the first book. And every page, it picks up a little momentum. And you get like 3/4 of the way in. And it is like every page is like doubling in speed. And you're just like, oh shit, what is going on now? And there's surprises being thrown at you in each way. And each one of those little surprises that start to resolve itself towards the end of the book, I thought what was great is they were questions that tickle your brain in the first couple novels. And then especially at the beginning of the book where you're like, there's something off in this. There's something weird. And then it's just like, there it is. That's why it's felt weird this whole time. When you approach a book like this, how do you figure out how to tread that line of not too much fantasy, but then also too much kind of militarized action?
Well, I've read a lot of fantasy, and I've read a lot of science fiction and other genres. And one of the things I hate is the info dump process. And so when I'm planning a book out, it's important for me to only give the readers what they need to know about the world building, about the language, about the magic systems, and so on, because I'm not writing a dictionary. I'm not writing an encyclopedia of that world. I'm writing a story about people in that world. And just as you're telling a story, about modern day people in America, you don't give the entire history of America or the history of the neighborhood they're in or the history of the bar that they're sitting and talking. You don't need all of that extra weight. The reader needs to know what the reader needs to know, and maybe a little more for spice. But so when I sit down to plan this, I don't want to make it a standard epic fantasy. I don't want to make it a standard military story. I write military spec ops stories, but even they're not done in a lot of the standard way these things are handled. And I write the kind of books I would read. When I was a kid, one of I had gotten to know Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson pretty well. And Bradbury, one of the things he told me was, don't just write the book you would read, write the book you would go out of your way to hunt down and read. So I'm reading for that inner reader who wants things to move along and to not carry, dead weight, and to ratchet up the tension as much as possible, but ameliorating that with some humor, some romance, some poetic moments. You balance it. And some of it happens in the first draft because, the first draft, you just want to get it out, boom, 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 boom. And some of it is more, I guess devious is a good word for it, going in there and manipulating the scenes so that each scene contributes to the whole, but no scene is a roadblock. You hit it and you have to stop and slow down and learn 55 songs from an ancient elven language that doesn't matter to any goddamn thing in the story. I don't need that. I was a big fan of Lord of the Rings growing up, but I hated the way Fellowship opened and The Hobbit opened. They both open with a party that has no value or point to the entire story. And if those books were sold today, no editor would buy them. They're republished because they're popular and they were a landmark, of course, and they're fantastic stories. But the structure of them is an archaic structure in fiction. And one last thing about that, we have, because of social media and the quickness of the internet and so on, we've become a very culturally ADD society, not medically. I'm talking about culturally ADD. We want it now. And I have fallen into that habit as a reader to a degree. And I certainly love that as a writer because I can remove all the filler and connective tissue and stuff that just is there to pad out a book and only write a book that has what I want, even though that did turn out to be a long book. I don't want it to slow down. I don't want the reader to completely catch their breath. Yes, breathe, but not completely catch their breath.
Well, and there is the old joke, it's, hack now, about how long it takes Tolkien to artfully describe things that just don't matter, blades of grass, trees, things like that. And I recently read a modern book that was the slowest burn book I have read in forever. And I was like, oh, I get what it is about this that I am struggling with. It reads like it's very old, and there's something off here about the pacing, and I need some sort of information about where this is going versus and I love character work, but eventually there comes a point where character work has to end and you don't need to know any more about the characters. You need to know a little bit more about the story. So you're right. You have hit a point where it's like, okay, here's what you need to know about the character and what they're doing right now. Here's what you need to know about the story. And like you said, it's not a small book. It's a great big tome, but it doesn't read like a great big tome.
Well, yeah, one of the things about character, I just want to pause on that for a second because character is very important to me as a writer. I mean, even my Spec Ops thrillers, my Joe Ledger series, they're character driven. They're not event driven, even though there are big events in it. They're character driven.
Right.
And when I was writing, the Kagen series, I use action to deepen character without having to info dump about the character. Like you don't find 3 or 4 pages telling you Kagan's backstory. He's captain of the guard. We've learned a couple of things about him, but we don't need every detail. The details that I do share about the character are ones that usually manifest while he's in motion, while something is happening. Like we learned about his empathy in book 1 and his sense of honor when he rescues the witch Selvath. Because she's about to be, lynched for being a witch, and the guys are going to sexually assault her. And none of that is in Kagan's life. He's a good guy.
Right.
And I wanted to write stories about, what do you have, like, what does it look like when a good guy is empathetic rather than simply serving the flag, serving the crown, serving the whatever? What if he's doing this because he actually feels it's right? Well, you can say that as much about that as you want about the character in the book, but if you show it, if you show him showing empathy, if you show him being kind, if you show him being tough, if you show him being a good leader, all of those things are best told in motion, and you don't need to carry as much of the narrative of the exposition if you're showing what that looks like.
I think that's a good point to dive into. That's a credit to your writing style, because I find that's a big portion of what I love, like when reading like a Joe Ledger book or the Kagan books, is kind of the chapter jumps where it's in the bad guy's point of view, then it's in the good guy's point of view, and it kind of balances out. And then there'll be the chapter of like a secondary character. Mm-hmm. So like in Ledger, it's maybe Bunny's perspective, but in this it's like Took's perspective. And what this book I think really drove home more so than the previous two is those secondary characters. You don't need their entire backstory. You know where they're from, you know their name, and you know that they've got to be good guys because they're hanging out with the good guy crew, right? Mm-hmm. But you learn a little bit each time they pop up in any chapter because of their actions. Mm-hmm. And I like that their history is not force-fed. And by the end of this last book, they're part of the family. Like, you are rooting for every one of them, whether they had multiple chapters over the entire series or just a few. When they start showing back up on that battlefield at the end of the book, I'm like, oh, I love this character. Let's get going. And you don't need that whole backstory all the time. And it comes back into everything starts to align. Do you
can I just throw one thing on that before you get to your question, just real quick? One of the reasons I do that is that if you give too much information in a dump about a character, it's hard for the reader to know what important thing they need to know in order to understand that character's actions as the story progresses. Mm-hmm. So, you may have more of it in your first draft, but there's a lot of cutting that happens in the final draft so that you cut away the stuff the reader doesn't really need to know, and that would be distracting and therefore make it a somewhat disappointing read. Whereas you want them to want to be with that character. And also, if you sketch it the right way, the reader knows a lot more about the character than is actually told to them. They can intuit the character, because I want people to be able to relate a lot of the characters to people they actually know. And I'm told, a lot of people say, oh, I have a friend, he's just like Took, or she's just like Philia. They're reading more into the character than I presented, but what they're doing is what I want them to do is to make the characters real for them.
I think he nailed that one for sure. With that, like, one of the characters that I found the most interesting to follow in this is the widow. In going through the 3 books and her evolution from that very ending of the first book, where you're like, oh shit, this is crazy. How her arc, how did you come to determine that, since she is sort of a secondary storyline to the series? Well,
the character of the widow came about separately from the Kagan stories. See, originally, a little backstory here. I had never planned to write epic fantasy. I love epic fantasy. I mean, the first book, I don't know if this is just audio only or video.
Video too.
Okay, so you guys can see where I'm pointing is a copy of Conan the Wanderer, the very first book I ever bought as a kid, right? I just interrupted myself. I lost my train.
Mary.
The widow.
The widow.
Okay,
being part of. I'm sorry. Yeah, a lot on my mind this morning. So sometimes you have characters that live in your head that are waiting their turn for a story, and sometimes you don't know where that story is going to be. Like Kagan, I've had that character in my head for many, many, many years, but I didn't know where he belonged. Sometimes, like as a writer, when you read a genre, you get ideas, and they kind of just float around, and then maybe if you decide to write it, those ideas kind of say, "Hey, I'm here." And she was one, and I wanted to write a novella about that character. And I would have probably written that novella, but then, my editor asked me if I would like to take a swing at writing fantasy. And I immediately grabbed that character. And she is an offshoot of the character of Miri, who was actually in the very first fantasy story I ever wrote, which is called The Hammer of God, which introduces Miri and Mother Frey years and years before I wrote Kagan, while Mother Frey is an active investigator for the House of Miracles. And Miri was her Watson to Mother Frey's Holmes. And I liked the character of Miri, but I actually wanted to enter into her experience with a character who didn't know the world and who was a good person, but very naive and very unlearned. And by exposure to this character who turns out to have layers and layers of her own belief systems, Miri turns out not to be really a nun of the harvest, but harvest religion, but actually a devotee of Cthulhu. Mm-hmm. And by exposure to that, Rissa finds herself. And then when the tragedy happens and Miri dies, that connection is so deep, it creates something that didn't exist before, that it couldn't have existed before the return of magic. So they become kind of a shared consciousness. And there is a extremely good chance I will write a Widow short story or maybe a novelette for a future Kagan short story collection that I anticipate doing, because I've got a bunch of short stories already done.
Oh, very interesting, especially because I was thinking, we were having this conversation, Jenny and I, before you hopped on, where I was looking at, I've been rewatching Game of Thrones recently. My wife had never seen it. We've been watching it, and I was like reading the third, I was reading Dragon in Winter at the same time we were rewatching, and I was like, there's something interesting here where Game of Thrones is a almost post-magic world that the kind of the focus of the series is they stamp the last of it out. The dragons die out. They kill the White Walkers. I mean, Bran is a warg, but he may or may not be the last of his kind. All the other, tree folk are gone from the north and everything. Whereas yours has been post-magic for thousands of years or however long it's been, and all of a sudden it's coming back. And I just saw that as an interesting parallel where I go, oh well, I kind of know basically what happens to Westeros now. They kind of follow a natural non-magical progression of history, whereas I don't know what happens to the Kagan world now that magic is back. And I go, oh, I really want to know what happens to the Kagan world now that magic is back.
Yeah, and as if I write more Kagan novels, which is a possibility, I even set a scene that kind of teased a future Kagan story. It's in the book. Mm-hmm. I want Kagan to be our proxy for seeing what magic looks like as it's returning, not only in what was the Silver Empire, but as across the continent and eventually off the continent to other places. Mm. I want Kagan to be our guide to a world that is rediscovering magic. And one of the most crucial scenes in that book actually doesn't involve Kagan. When Jekyll and Falker and Alabax are on the ice schooner and the creature breaks through the ice, the creature born into that moment because magic has returned. That whole chapter is probably the most important chapter for understanding what magic means now to the world of Kagan. And it was also the very first chapter I wrote of the third book.
Oh, wow. It's very, very well done, chat. It's just, you really do capture the majesty and the awe and the kind of what in the world kind of, feeling that everybody in that ice schooner would be feeling at that moment as this giant bull flying moose type creature just erupts out of the ice. So
yeah, and one of the things about awe in a story, it's very hard to convey a sense of awe. There's usually shock, there's usually horror, but often in fiction, somebody encounters something that is literally awesome, and what happens is 2 chapters later they're back to being themselves. Where that scene in the ice informs what Jekyll and Falker will do and Alabaxer will do once they find Fabaldir, because without that, there may be a completely different way they approach this poor tortured dragon.
Yeah.
So it gave them not only a sense of awe but a sense of respect for a world much larger than their experience, in which they should not impose their views because they don't know what applies, this new rules. And the more elastic a character is in terms of adapting to a changing world, the more interesting the character is, because if they're just totally set in their ways, it's like, okay, that's one note, we got it. So, but if the character is evolving because of the things they experience, then it's fun to follow that character through the growth of that insight and how it manifests in their later actions.
I like too that the twins are, I believe they're kind of the most important part of this story. Like, I know you're following Kagan through it, but every chapter that it would go for their pack heading to the ice, that is a standalone story in of itself. And the growth of those two characters was really that similar to what you're saying earlier. That's when the characters came to life, because you feel like that might be your buddy or somebody like that that's experiencing all these outer world adventures. The travel up to the north, right? Winterland. It was exciting, but when they got to that cave, that's when their characters really shined. How did you approach that? And did you know the death and the rebirth was already going to happen, or did that develop after you're getting into it? Because there's a lot of heart in those episodes, both with the dragon and with the twins.
Well, 80% of the book was plotted out before I wrote Word 1 of the first book.
Wow. Okay.
Because I definitely like plotting, and I like complex plots, and it's hard to write a complex plot if you don't have a roadmap. So I give myself the plot, and I knew from the first time I introduced Fabaldir in Kagan's Dreams, I knew what I wanted the ending of that story to be, and I did not want Kagan to be the one who does it. And that's an important thing for a lot of my stories. The hero doesn't do everything. There are a lot of people that contribute to a success or a defeat or whatever. And the twins, even though they're not twins, the Vale twins have their own arc, and I didn't want them to be just an epic fantasy version of the Weasley twins. I wanted them to have similar banter in nature, and I think to a great degree there is a little bit of the Weasley twins in there. I mean, let's face it. But there's also every other buddy comedy story. The two that banter back and forth, but it's not who they really are. Their heart is different than their banter. And so I wrote that. And one of the things I do when I write novels like this is I sometimes will write an entire subplot by itself. Like, so I'll write a whole series of chapters and then fit them into the overall manuscript. I did that with The Widow. I did it with the Kagan's brothers. I did it with the arc of the children, the real twins, and the arc of the Prince of Games, rather, because I wanted him to have an arc where people could understand his actual motivations, because they assume he's evil, but he's not actually evil. And I wanted to play that. So I write those arcs, somewhat separately, or sometimes I'll take a section of an arc and write it separately, like the chapters dealing with the hacking attack on Princess Thika's ship, where the Widow is, we see when she is using her powers deliberately. It's like, holy moly. And that was one of the most fun chapters to write, by the way, that sea battle. Plus, I read a lot of sea stories too. And I was able to finally bring in stuff from C.S. Forester and Patrick O'Brien and the other Navy novelists that I read.
Okay.
That's a fun similarity too. Like at the same time as reading this for book club, I was reading Eaters of the Dead. And there's the great story where they're like really afraid to go out into the water and the big monsters, but it ends up just being like gray whales, right? They're just monstrous whales. So when that scene was going, I'm just imagining gigantic octopus like attacking the ship and the big tentacles just knocking everybody off. But it took it to that next level where you're like, yeah, that doesn't exist. So this is kind of messed up and awesome in the general. How much when you started plotting this, with it being epic fantasy, was the Lovecraftian appearance, was that one of your first milestones, or
Sure.
was that sprinkled in as the story developed?
No, it was intended. I've added cosmic horror elements, Lovecraft, but also not just Lovecraft, but Robert W. Chambers and August Derleth and other people who wrote in the cosmic horror world. I've, partly because I'm editor of Weird Tales magazine, and that's where
Yes.
genre was, is largely published. But I've had Lovecraftian elements in Joe Ledger.
Mm-hmm.
And a number of other stories. My Necrotech series, which is deep space cosmic horror, has a lot of it
nice
in there. And that whole series is what happens if the premise of Necrotech. Space station trying to prove matter teleportation, accidentally teleports the entire station 53,000 light years away to the far side of the galaxy. They will never be able to come back. And they find out that creatures like Cthulhu came to Earth not to conquer, but because they were afraid of what's out there.
Oh, I'll tell you, Necrotech is the only one of your books I haven't got right out the gate, simply because I like paperback books, and this is the first one of your books I've ever seen in hardcover. So when it came out in hardcover, I was like, oh no, I have to wait.
It'll be out in paperback next year. I just finished the second book in the series, and we'll be continuing that series. But I love the Lovecraftian elements. So when I was asked to pitch pitch Kagan, or epic fantasy, the Lovecraftian elements were in my original pitch. I mean, it started out as that, as epic fantasy with mythology, poetry from the 19th and 20th centuries, and actually some earlier, like Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, and Lovecraftian elements all kind of sewn together into the story. Marilena, for example, by the way, is the Lady of Shalott from Tennyson. She's also La Belle Dame sans Merci from Keats, et cetera, et cetera. And her parents are, the king and queen of the fairies from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. So I deliberately sewed them in, those elements into the story, because this is the future of Earth. This is 50,000 years from now. Mm-hmm. And I give hints that it may actually be 50,000 years after the events of my zombie series, the Dead of Night series, followed by Rotten Ruins series, because that is the end of the world as we know it. But also threw in the Yellowstone caldera, because why wouldn't I?
Right. And you brought up the Prince of Games, who of course you've said is other historical trickster. He's a trickster god and everything. But there's something interesting about taking a character whose goals are chaos, and then creating a villain, your Yellow King, and going, this guy is too messed up and maybe even too chaotic for my chaos god. Like, he's so out there that even the chaos god is like, maybe I shouldn't be here.
This is an interesting turn, because I saw it differently, Matt. Oh. I saw it as he's a trickster. He's the chaos machine, basically, but he wants the chaos to continue. If the Witch King got what he wanted, nothing continues. So it was almost like a survival trick, right?
But sure. even if the Witch King wins and Hastur rises and so on, it will eventually settle into a static order. It'll be that version of the world ruled by the Witch King in demigod form and Hastur in god form in flesh. So it would then settle away from chaos into a new static order of that domination. And the Prince of Games, Nicodemus, same character, doesn't want that to happen, because he doesn't want there to be so dramatic an imbalance that it settles into either peace or permanent conflict. He wants things to be able to change. And he does point out that, the bad guys essentially are the ones more likely to start trouble, and therefore have, chaos is fun. But there was an important thing about the Prince of Games in the third book, that he does not like when the Witch King starts tampering with the natural order, especially as it applies to the larger world. That offends him, because he is part of this natural world. He was born with the earth. He's a chaos spirit, but he's born with the earth. So to change that so radically that the earth no longer looks like what it should would both offend and endanger him. So he wouldn't want to continue helping along that path.
Yeah, and all those scenes with your King in Yellow with that character changing the animals and everything is just so unsettling. And you're right, it's the idea of like this is, and you have the hippopotamus later and everything where it's like this is, you're right, this is not right, this is not natural, this, and it becomes even uncomfortable to just kind of read, which is uncomfortable. There's a, I think scary is kind of an overrated term. I think there's more art in uncomfortable and things that you sit with and think about later. So
I'll add into that too. There's a beauty with that scariness, though, in the way that this was written, is that when it's through the Witch King's eyes, it's power and creation in his mindset. But when you see it through like the widow's eyes or the twins, they see it and it's completely empathy, and it's just, there's a sadness of like, this isn't right, we've got to help these beings. And it takes that monster and it makes it real. And I love the whole, almost like the animal rights type sense in this book, because there's a lot of that, even with the dragons. It's just, we've got to make this right. Yeah, really beautiful.
Respect for the natural world is a factor in a lot of my writing, because I have great respect for the natural world itself. And it's not like I'm, anti-hunting or anything. What I'm against is people who use the natural world purely for sport without respecting it. So, and I use hunting as an example. I have a number of friends who hunt because they eat what they hunt. I have no issue with that at all.
Yeah.
Somebody who hunts to put a trophy on the wall disgusts me.
Yeah.
Because you're taking all your technology and your camouflage and your scopes and everything else against an animal that has no actual defense and can't perceive the level of threat. It's not a fair fight. So the trophy is not a trophy of victory at all. And therefore, I find it disgusting, disquieting that somebody would do that. So when I write about the natural world, the people that I resonate more with are those who, they may dig, they may build, they may cut a tree, they may kill an animal, but they're doing it because they're living in the natural world, and those are elements of survival in that world. And I respect that kind of mindset, that approach to the natural world. When I was a kid, one of my dearest friends, growing up in Philadelphia, was a Navajo kid his family had come out here. His father was doing some construction work out here, and he was out here for a few years. And after school, after I graduated, I went out to the Navajo res and spent 6 weeks out there. And we went out hunting a couple times with his uncle, and he would be singing prayers to a deer, asking the deer if it's okay to kill him, thanking the deer for everything from hide to meat to bone that he'll use. And it was a beautiful thing. Even though I don't like seeing an animal killed, I thought that was what living in harmony with nature actually means, because nature kills.
Yeah.
But nature doesn't, a wolf doesn't kill 5 animals if it needs to eat only one. So I like that idea of balance in nature and respect for it. And my principal characters generally have some version of that same respect for nature that I do. And also, I'm a dog lover, and I love rescue animals. And I see, when you go to a shelter to get a rescue animal, you hear the stories of how these animals got abandoned and how they went up in the shelter. And there's a lot of cruelty and cold-heartedness in it. And that's more reflected in the Witch King's viewpoint than in, say, Kagan's or Jekyll and Falker or the Widow.
That's a good way of explaining it too. As a dog rescue, we've got 2 of them running around this place. When you do go there, it's not the breed, it's not anything like that, but you can tell in their eyes, that they've walked 1,000 miles. It's having that connection that you can take out into the world to just try to make it better.
Yeah.
This is a weird tie-in, because that's got a poetry to it, and I'm going to move to comical. The costuming for our good friend Nicodemus slash the Prince of Games, every time it explains what he's wearing, I just laugh because my first introduction to him was in Ledger, and I always just see him as like the powerful one, you know. In the the last,
in Ledger, he was introduced as a prisoner in a
yeah. But he still always has that kind of like, but him in a jester suit, every time I'm just like, wait, what? But it added so much flavor to the scenes because he just messes with people. So just to picture him in a colorful garb, I'm like, all right. So that
was fun.
One of my favorite. But have you counted how many times in the 3 books that Took says balls?
No, but I know some people who have done it. I should get the list. That's based on a buddy of mine. When I was the bodyguard, my partner for a lot of the gigs we were on is basically Took.
Okay.
I mean, the same personality, the same, everything was balls. He didn't swear by balls, but he always made some comment that was a balls comment. And I thought that was hilarious. And it was very uniquely him, to the point where after he realized he was doing it, he deliberately did it. Whereas some people, they have a verbal tick and they don't realize it, but he deliberately played on it. So, and that guy has, since passed, unfortunately, but I kept him alive as Took. And I have a lot of readers who will send me messages that are basically just by the something something balls or the something something, contributing their own Took lines, and a couple of them actually their Took lines wound up in the 3rd book.
Oh, that's fun.
Oh, it's super fun.
Yeah, I liked all of the Took and Philia, but we were talking about kind of the third. Jenny just reminded me, not very indirectly, but she was talking about over the course of the 3 books, and I want to talk about something I really loved over the course of 3 books because I talk all the time. I'm a mark. I don't see things coming. I just buy into what is in front of me. I don't try to figure out the mystery and everything. So when we finally get all the way near the point where the man is finally going to come out of the ice, I still did not, for the life of me, know who was coming out of that ice. And when the switch comes where the Witch King really is who he claims to be, his own given name, and he's not who everybody else thinks he is, I was like, man, bravo, you got me. Like, you really did. I was thinking to myself, is Joe gonna come out? Did Joe get frozen in? Like, who in the heck is coming out of this ice? So when it turns out to be Herapath, I'm like, wait a minute.
And that was planned from the very beginning. If you ever get a chance to reread the books, if somebody does that, there are clues right from the beginning.
I'm sure there are. But
there are clues that it is Herapath and clues that it's not. Probably the most obvious clue is the title of one of the Gethon Hecklin papers that he wrote about mental transference and theriomorphy.
Yeah, I didn't catch up on that until after it was too late.
Which is totally fine because some people, about I guess 30% of the people I've talked to about the books figured out who the Witch King was in book 1. And a slightly smaller group figured out who it was in book 3. And also there was a bunch of folks, probably close to 50%, who figured out who the royal twins belonged to and why they had survived the slaughter. And of course that is explained at the end of book 2, when Kagan is going down to fight the Shoggoth, finds out that it is Herapath's children, and that changes a lot of the story. Also, one of the things I enjoy doing in the book is, when we first hear about the Silver Empire, it's a shining example of goodness, but it's not. It is better than what the Yellow Empire will be, but it's not. I mean, like most things, it has its own corruption, its own prejudices, and own evils. And Herapath was as a threat to Jessalyn, the Empress. So she actually, if Herapath had actually went up being the Witch King, it would have been her fault.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because there is the line, history is written by the victors, and so there's a thing going on right now. You did it like you said, it's a shining example of goodness, but it's really not. And Star Wars man baby somewhat fans are kind of having a freak out over the idea that maybe the Jedi haven't always been good, which even George Lucas put literally right in those other three movies, that prequel trilogy, that the Jedi were not always good, but they're still going back and forth on that. There's an idea that like, no, like everybody's kind of like there's some people in the world that are truly just good through and through, but mostly they kind of don't run the world. Like the people that run the world, there's better people than other people that run the world,
That's what's
There's an old saying that political compromise often leads to corruption.
Yeah.
And that is true with people, and it is true with empires, and it's true with whatever. In order to govern, you often have to make a number of compromises that you don't want to make. And eventually the compromise becomes the easier path, and that corrupts your original ideology, and it's no longer that. And we see that a lot we're seeing a lot in politics right now. On both sides, they're both playing politics, and despite my particular political biases, even my side I see doing that. And it annoys me, but I understand it.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too, especially since this story revolves around gods and faith and, the harvest, all of that, where there is that in shifting and having you look at who you thought was the most perfect of the empire and putting them in a negative light, and then figuring out that there's a little bit of truth to the greatness, and there's a little bit of truth to the darkness. And in between, it's those gray areas that make the story real. I think that was done really well, because especially once those tells start coming to light, then you're like, did she actually create the Witch King because of her own fears of losing her powers or whatever? Even at the end, when you're learning the truth of it, there's still that little twinge of she still did something wrong, right? Like she was never, from the very first page when they were the perfect family to the very last page and you realize that they weren't, there's still love in there, which was, I thought, really cool in the idea of gods, because we want to make our leaders into gods. We want them infallible.
And also the gods themselves are not infallible. In fact, the gods especially the one like Hastur and Cthulhu and the harvest gods, some of them are actually creations of Lovecraft and others, where they're actually aliens who are so powerful that they're indistinguishable from gods. With the harvest gods, I kind of suggest that because I forget which of the books, one or two, it even says that the version of them that he sees is not the version that they actually are. There's a more monstrous aspect. But they abandoned Kagan when it was not his fault. So they're actually bad gods. They're not generous, they're not merciful, they're not forgiving, and they're also not particularly insightful because they turned their back on him. And it was not his fault. He was drugged, and that's why he couldn't protect anyone in the first book.
And that's a really important moment in the final book to have somebody really explain it to him. Like, look, they shouldn't have, like, you didn't do anything wrong. Like, you may think you're damned, but like the reality is none of it's on you. Like, it's all on them for behaving that way.
Yeah.
So that's also, I thought, and and again, it was right there in front of me. I just didn't think of it that way.
I mean, and that's perfectly fine.
Which, but I think it's
mystery,
Yeah, I think it's a lot of fun. I have a friend who I don't know how he watches anything. He knows how it ends before it. I'm like, how do you watch anything and get any enjoyment out of anything? Like, I find it's more enjoyable to have it come to me in waves. And, he can't help it. It's not like he's trying to do it. It just happens.
But I'm kind of on the same boat there as I guess because I'm a professional storyteller, I'm looking at the structure of the story as I'm watching it. I'm enjoying it, also looking at the structure while I'm watching it and saying, this would be the next logical thing in that chain of logic of cause and effect. This event plus this event leads to an inevitable ending. Well, if you can get an idea of what that chain of events actually is, the significant events within a story, you can follow them. And I like doing it. It doesn't spoil it for me. In fact, when I get to it and it is the ending that I think best tells that story, I'm happy. Good example of that was Godzilla -1. I saw almost all of the big reveals before they happened, and I was cheering on those reveals because I wanted them to happen.
Okay.
So gratified at the end. It's all the way up to the scene. I don't know if you saw the movie, but the scene at the end of the hospital.
Yep.
I saw that happening in the way we thought she died. They did not show her crushed under something. They shown her blown away by force winds.
Right.
Which means that the character, if you don't see the character dead, the character's not dead. The potential for them to still be alive is there. And it mattered to that character that she was there because at the end, even though it's, people will say, oh, that's a bit of a coincidence. Yeah, it is. But life is often like that. We see disasters and we find people surviving when they shouldn't have. But the question she asked him at the end is, basically, are you able to, is your war over now? Are you able to rest? Was one of the most powerful things. They got me to the place I was expecting, and they made that scene perfect. And that to me that's superb writing.
Beautiful. Okay, I have a question, and I'm not sure if it's something that I missed or if it's something I was supposed to miss, and it's something to come. Ice. Ice is a big one, especially in this story. Therapath in the ice, melting the ice around the dragon, like a lot of things that it's encapsulated in ice. But in the very beginning, in the very first book, in his dreams, there's modern people in ice. Mm-hmm. Did I miss it, or is it a story plot that's still coming to be? Is the, let's say, the Rotten Ruin land, are they encapsulated in ice for magic, or is that a natural disaster that then magic used to encapsulate things later?
A natural disaster that caught people up in it. Something caused global winter, and it was at the end of some apocalyptic event. And it might be the Rotten Ruin event, it might be something else. Even I haven't landed on, because I have literally five different ways that story can happen. But the stuff trapped in the ice is partly there to establish this is in fact Earth, and partly there because global winter would create new glaciers and so on, and or nuclear winter rather. So I wanted to have that there, but I do plan more Kagen stories, and one of the reasons I melted the ice at the end is because now a lot of that stuff is released. Not all of it is as dead as it should be. So
one of my favorite parts in this book, though, is when Kagen and Therapath are trying to catch up with, like, what is going on? It's been a few hours for me. It's been months for you, et cetera, et cetera. And he's like, there are so many things. They had armor that allowed them to walk on moons, and I'm just like, oh, astronauts.
Yeah.
Like those little things.
Cars are in there, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, the car too, like talking about there's a carriage, but there's no way to pull the horse, and I'm just like, this is kind of cool. So with that, do you have any directions of where we'll have those little tickles?
Well, yeah, I mean, with the Easter egg I left in there about a possible next series, the Serpent Men, there's one little chapter where they're watching this battle unfold, and they say, this is not our fight, it's not our time, and they go back underground. That sets up a future Kagen story, and the consequences of the meltwater, the ice melting. Those things are going to impact everything on that continent, and that allows me. I've got 3 novels and 8 short stories already kind of outlined to pick up on those elements and move them forward if I do another Kagen series. And if I don't do another Kagen series of novels, I'll do a series of short stories and novelettes like Robert E. Howard did with Conan and Carl Edward Wagner did with Kane. We have novels, but I like driving the character's narrative often with short stories as well.
I like short stories as well. They're so great, and it lets you get just kind of peeks at other things. Like you mentioned earlier, the other side of the continent. I'm really curious about that side of the continent and what's going on over there, because you look at the map and you're like, holy moly, there's a lot more stuff going on that we haven't even touched yet. And then you mentioned other continents, and I went, oh, yeah, that's right. There's really lots of other stuff that we could potentially know about. And you don't necessarily need to know huge chunks of all of it, but also I think short stories are also a format that not enough people these days consume or produce, for that matter. So
Yeah, I fell in love with short stories shortly after I started writing novels. I was invited to write short stories for 2 different anthologies. Like in the same week, I got 2 invitations, and now I've written about 170 of them, and I've actually got 2 short story collections coming out this year. The next up is next month is Midnight Lullabies. It's a collection of my horror short stories, which includes some new stuff and actually some horror poetry.
Ooh.
And I have a collection of my Monk Addison short stories coming out at the end of the year with an introduction by Jim Butcher. And I love the Monk Addison character, and a couple producers right now are looking at Monk Addison for possible TV stuff.
I like to Monk. That's another kind of fingerprint that I like going throughout your books is tattoos play a big part. And the character development of some of the tribes that are either helping Kagan's crew or not helping it, the spiders, tattoos, and just how everything about their skin symbolizes where they're at in the world, or if they're good, they're bad, that sort of thing. Do you plan on continuing that, like outside of Monk?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wrote a whole novel about tattoos called Ink, and it's funny, I don't have any tattoos. My brother, who had served several tours in Nam, by the time of his death a few years ago, he was covered everywhere except his face in tattoos. Each tattoo told a very specific story about some part of his life, positive or negative. And I found it so fascinating because there are people who get tattoos for decoration. There are people who get tattoos because it's a mile marker in their life. And they don't ever want to forget that mile marker because something about it changed either their trajectory or their nature, going forward. Or they want to record a with clarity. And, Ink doing that, did that. My character of Monk Addison is kind of an example of he carries around everything he's ever done, and because he still has his old military tattoos as well as all the faces, screaming faces and so on. But I tattoos are one of the motifs that are frequent in my novels. Night birds being another thing that are very frequent in my novels. And that is a lot of fun for me to do. And I plan to continue doing that with no real stops, not in every story though, but in a fair, wherever it is appropriate for that to add some dimension to the story, then definitely.
Yeah, so far
Very
they've
cool.
been used really well. That's the other thing I want to note, which was so great. And I personally felt like it helped pull me into the fantasy world that I'm not naturally akin to, is even those little hints that tie into other stories. It's got that hint of the Rotten Ruin, Dark as Night type series. It's got Nicodemus, so it brings in, like you're wanting Church and Ledger in there. Like they're separate, they're different worlds, but there's always that thread that could bring them in. Mm-hmm. Do you have any plans going forward for something, let's say Ledger, to have some of the Kagan world introduced in it that might not exist now?
No, the only connective tissue between Kagan and the Ledger is the Nicodemus character, and he actually will probably show up in my Necrotech series at some point, because I already introduced the God Machine in the second Necrotech book, which is from the Ledger series and from other stories I have written. So there's some connective tissue in that the Kagan world and the Ledger world are the same world. It's the same timeline. Whether Rotten Ruin is the same timeline as Ledger is something that I kind of dispute even myself, because that I see that as one possible future. But I in my head, Ledger's future, he saves the world, even up to the point where he dies or retires, he saves the world. It doesn't become the zombie apocalypse. But we do have that split off, and that started during his first exposure to the God Machine, which is the interdimensional doorways. But the Kagan universe is the same universe as the current Ledger series. It's just there's no other connective tissue except for Prince of Games. A lot of people wondered if Mother Frey was descended from Church. No. If anything,
it seems doable.
Doable, yeah. But she was created in that short story I mentioned earlier for an anthology about alternate Sherlock Holmes stories, where the Sherlock Holmes and Watson characters were anything except white males. So I did females and in a fantasy setting. And I co-edited the anthology, but the publisher had wanted me to put a story in there. So I wrote The Hammer of God, which is that story.
That is Baker Street Irregulars.
Baker Street Irregulars, yes. Yep. And I had a lot of fun with that. And I loved the characters, and I wanted to do more with them. And but the Ledger world's not going to interact with the Kagan world in any way that I have planned at this point, other than the presence of the Prince of Games, who was immortal.
Yeah. And I want to go back to just speaking of interacting, and earlier on you were talking about, you're not looking to write a dictionary or anything like that. I do think for anybody that is fantasy curious, the books are very large, which to some people is also very daunting, but it's not a difficult world to get into. There's not a huge amount of family lineages. You don't have to remember who is related to who. People don't have I'll use an example. I know everybody is loving House of the Dragon on HBO right now. I have very hard time remembering who the characters are, because especially in the Targaryen family, they all have very similar names to each other. There's none of that going on in the Kagen the Damned series. Everybody kind of has, nobody's name is like somebody else's. There's not a huge amount of relations going on. Kagan has brothers, but they're pretty easy to keep track of, So if you're fantasy curious, but like Tolkien or Martin or something like that seems like it's just too dense and confusing. There's not a lot of that going on here, but it's still very, very fantasy. So it's a good, I find a good bridge for anybody that may be interested in fantasy.
Well, the person I think who did it best to have, especially with like a large family with lineage, was Roger Zelazny with his Amber novels. I don't know if you've ever read those, but
No.
there's 10 of them, 2 groups of 5. And it's called, the first one's 9 Princes and Ambers, 9 princes and 3 or 4 princesses living in this eternal city. And when you need to know more about it, one of them, they tell you more. Sometimes they'll give you, like, they're all on tarot cards at one point. So sometimes someone will go through a tarot card, like the way that was presented, the main character is recovering from a head injury and amnesia. So by looking through the cards and seeing the family on the cards, he's able to remember. But each one is given like a line or two, just a snapshot, not an entire history. We don't need a page on each one. Later on, when a character of Random or Brand or someone else is introduced in those books, you may get a little more backstory, but it's for context to understand what then is going to happen in that scene. And I like that approach. I don't want, again, to write an encyclopedia of the world of Kagan. It is of no value to me to do that. And I'm certainly no value to the reader. And I have friends, colleagues who write books that are about that thick, and a lot of it I feel doesn't necessarily need to be there. And I have friends who write thick books, and every word matters. Joe Abercrombie is a good example for that. When he writes, his first law books, I'm hanging on every word. Terry Goodkind, I certainly respect his ability, but the books are doorstops. And there's a lot of the stuff in there that is world building that I don't feel drives the narrative as quickly or as briskly as I, as a reader, like. I'm not saying he's wrong, because there are people who love that. Sure. And he's writing for that audience. It isn't what I like. My favorite fantasy writers are the ones who move things along pretty quickly, even with a complex backstory. Michael Moorcock with his Eternal Champion series. He's got 40 different series, and all of them are the same character and different avatars of the same character. Carl Edward Wagner's Kane series. You get a little bit of a snapshot of Kane in each book, in each story, but he's also a different personality in each story because he's immortal, and therefore different ages, he's different, different personality traits emerge. And I like that. I like that approach.
Yeah.
I think too, going on what you were saying, Matt, too, is that, yeah, it's daunting when you look at a book, and I mean, this is thick.
125 pages. Yep.
Yeah. But what works great with this, especially going back to what I was saying about like me not diving into fantasy that often, is the chapters are short. And the way that they're separated between action or character, I do a lot of my reading when I'm working. If I'm waiting for a file to download, I try to get a chapter in, or I get 2 chapters in. And I never, through all 3 of the books, I never had a feeling that I couldn't jump back in. And I didn't have that feeling where I had to go 30 pages before I finished a chapter. It was to the point I'm in the story. I can take a break, come back, and I'm still in the story without having to reintroduce myself to it, which definitely give you props on that writing style. I think especially with heftier books, it works really good and flows. So if anybody's terrified of a over 500 page book, don't be. It moves along quickly.
Yeah,
I read this in a week and a half.
It's also entertaining to me because I write fast. I mean, I wrote Dragon and Winter in 89 days.
Oh, wow.
I write a novel every 3 months while also doing short stories and editing a magazine and other things. I like writing fast. And for me to write a long chapter gets dull for me as the writer. And if it's getting dull for me when it's my own work, it's going to be dull for the reader. So I like the short chapters. I like the basically an ensemble cast with multiple narratives going on, and the jump cuts. I'm very much a cinematic type of writer in the way I plot my stories. I know how I want it to look on a screen. So I want to be able to do those jump cuts. You do a little bit of this narrative, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and come back to this, come back to that. And some of the intervening chapters, maybe between 2 action scenes, is a little slower because I want you to be able to catch your breath. The book moves at a fast pace. I don't want that pace to be like a single screeching note.
Yes.
But that to have, and the breakup allows me to do that, and it also allows me to cut out transitional material. So when I jump back to a particular plot line, it can be a little further along. I don't have to drag in everything that happened between the last time. They get it. It's and I think my writing comic books influences that a lot to me because, the action, there's an old saying, the action happens between the panels. So, you have the Rhino going after Spider-Man. Next thing you know, Spider-Man is punching the Rhino. You don't need to see him blocking the Rhino's attack. And then all you need to know is attack, counter punch, and we get it. We fill in the blanks because it's like watching individual cells of a movie. And I like doing that when I write. That's why I liked the way they did, especially Return of the King. The Battle of Pelennor Fields was a very complex battle with a lot of different point of view characters. And they gave each dramatic moments rather than simply checking in on them. They're each doing something, and that collectively was one single narrative of that battle. But we got the advantage of, with the shorter chapters, the shorter scene breaks, cuts. What we get is all these collective points of view, making it a much fuller experience than one character could give us if we're just following that one character through the entire fight.
It's awesome that you said that too. I told Matt that there is a scene in this book that is so cinematic, and it was such a tribute to Lord of the Rings, but the spirits from the tower, when they hit the battlefield, I'm like, that's the ghost coming off the ship. And was it Return of the King or Two Towers, where they just
Return of the King?
That scene, I'm like, this, I can picture it. And it felt very, very much a tribute to Lord of the Rings. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but
it wasn't. But certainly makes me feel good.
It was awesome. But that's another thing, especially in the last quarter of the book when all the shit hits the fan. the chapters move very quickly, but there's so much visuals that happen within the words. And you don't get dragged down by like explaining the fur, the blood, or the broken bodies, but you get just enough where Took is like, he's dragging, can't move his arm. Every one of those monsters when they're taking the kneel on the battlefield, going just in this. We're not supposed to be here. We're not natural. Like it's so beautiful in the sense that it's just carnage, but it's fast, and me as the reader can envision it, which goes back to what you're saying about like having that cinematic touch to it. Could definitely go to screen easily.
For me, one of the most cinematic moments writing the book, and I do try to visualize it, is the vampire attack on Marilina's castle or tower.
Oh, yes.
I had so much fun writing that.
It shows. That scene is awesome.
I can see it. I can see her descending the stairs. I can see Duke Sarkani being all badass, like, yeah, I'm going to destroy you. And it's like, why are all my people dead?
Yeah.
What's the line too? It's like, I left his tongue because it was fun to hear him scream or something like that. I'm like, what just happened?
Yeah, well, she's been in that tower for a long time. You can expect a certain level of indignation when she finally gets to revenge on the person who caused that change.
And the vampires couldn't feel it coming, but I, as a reader, could feel it coming, that they were making the biggest possible mistake by busting into her tower, because we had already established that she's in that tower because she's so incredibly dangerous, and that
even her mother didn't want her out there.
Even her mother didn't want her in the world. Her mother thought she was too dangerous. So it's like every time they ram into the wall, it's like, none of you really know that you're in a lot of trouble now.
Well, what you were saying, Matt, of like predicting things, I did not predict that. I'm like, don't take her out. She's one of my favorite characters.
No, I
thought that the vampires may win, but adding in that level of the history between her and the Lord Vampire, like gave it that extra bit. But I think my favorite part of that scene, and what I'm saying about how you can tell you had fun with it, is every scene with her in all in the two previous books and up to that point, there's a sadness to her. There's I want this to work, but I am kind of defenseless. I can protect this tower, but that's it. But the moment she steps out, it's an entirely different character. And then later in the book, when she was explaining that she doesn't want to see Kagen again because he would not recognize her now. And just the removing the shackles just changed her and empowered her. I was just like, damn, good job.
Yeah.
I spent 35 years of my adult life teaching women's self-defense. And I always loved seeing someone who, little backstory, in women's self-defense class, I taught 14 of those years at Temple University, and almost every woman who took the class had taken it because something had happened to her. Small or large, it was always bad. And over the course of teaching the program, seeing them realize that they are worth fighting for and that they can learn to fight. They become powerful. That process, that's where Marilina was born. Somebody who was, for whatever reason, trapped and helpless, discovering her power and embracing that power, celebrating her freedom through that power. And she's one of my favorite characters. And she, because of all the poetic, like one of the things I don't know if I mentioned last time we were doing this, but I actually read poetry aloud every day before I write. Sometimes as much as 45 minutes of it aloud, because I want to perform it to a degree. I want to hear it as with the inflections and the pauses and the beats and so on. I want to hear it. And, I was reading a lot of Tennyson when I created the character of Marilina in the first book. I was reading The Lady of Shalott. And it's such a tragic story. And she does die at the end of that poem. And her magic mirror, her loom, they're out of that poem, Lady of Shalott. And the pale kings and princes that are buried there is out of, Keats. And they're all tragic poems, but I didn't want her to have a tragic ending. I did, however, want her romance with Kagen to end, because it's an impossible romance. She's an immortal, and she's good, but not nice.
Right.
Kagan is actually good and fairly nice, even though, Branks would disagree. The guy he fought up in Nelphidia,
Right.
which my audiobook reader said was my most brutal fight scene ever. It's like, fair
Oh,
enough.
fair enough. Yeah.
But Marilena was one of my favorite characters, and I have many things planned for her in the future.
Oh, good.
I'm glad to hear that, because that's actually what my next question when it comes to her is. There's a new popularity in seeing the same story told through a different eye. Like you've got James, which is like the new point of view of Huck Finn, or Cersei, the new view of the Odyssey. And you take a character that has importance in these very popular or historical or classic books, and you turn it to see it through a different eyes. And I was curious if you ever had any intention on her point of view on the rise of the Yellow Empire.
Yeah, in fact, if I do the Marilena book that I am considering doing, it would be her story, from being a young princess of the fairies and meeting Sarkani and all that happened, and a lot more about the things that have happened over the centuries or the thousands of years in her tower, and then going, well, where you have this incredible force of magic. What happens when her own kin want to come back into this world? She might be in opposition to that. And it would be interesting to have somebody who was half vampire, half fairy, and who is now 50 times more powerful than she was when she was imprisoned, up against her own mother in a battle. And that is the backstory, or the skeleton of a book I intend to write one of these days. And it would be cool. All from Marilena's point of view.
Very cool.
Even so with this, like when she has so much impact in the story, but when you think about her actual interactions with Kagan, I mean, it's weeks, not years. But this takes place over months. So there's a lot of time. And I'm like, what was she doing in that tower? Until that day that vampire decided he had some big balls and he was going to try it. And it didn't work out well for him. Like, what was the moving pieces with her? Like, she's definitely a fascination of mine through it. Her and the widow, I think, are we got enough about them in the story to know how they impacted the story, but there's all those areas of like, what were they doing during this time? But that's just
and that's the fun thing is I want the reader to want to know more of what those characters are. I mean, I've had a lot of requests for a Jekyll and Faulkner novel. It's just those two guys. I even had a couple people ask if I would ever tell a story of what happens to Alec Baxter afterwards. And I was like, that would be an interesting plot thing to sort out.
You would have to. You're like, I would have to think about that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I hadn't intended for his story to go past this book.
Sure.
But you never know which characters people are going to connect with. I have people who want more of the Therian Navy, Captain of the Otakon, and like what happens when what's the story of the Therian Navy going forward? Because now there's no empire. Each nation has to fend for itself. How long will the peace actually last? Yeah.
Very good. Good point. Well, Jenny, I don't know if you have anything else left, but as we all know, and as he's been kind of explaining, he's a very, very busy guy. He's got all these books that he's still gotta pump out. He's 3 novels a year and all his short stories and everything like that. So 3 or 4 novels a year. Yeah, very true. And so, Jenny, unless you have anything else left, I can
go on for hours. I probably have like 20 more questions, but we'll let you get back at it. But I do have to say, cannot wait for the release of the next Ledger book. Like the way the last one ended, I'm like,
very true.
When will this podcast go up?
We can chat that. It was preferably Tuesday, but we can delay it since it's going to be a refresh, since this is a little post-release of it. Give you some
the reason I ask is we are dropping really, really, really big Kagan or Joe Ledger news tomorrow.
Oh, well, this will be
So
after
Tuesday,
that.
then it will be after. Let's
Okay.
do it.
So
I'm
here's the
always
news.
need some Kagan or Kagan and Joe, dude. We have all done it at least once in this interview.
We have.
They're so great. Yes, give me Joe news.
So Joe Ledger has been optioned by Chad Stahelski, director of the John Wick movies, for
Oh,
TV.
wow.
And he
For
is an
TV?
actual
Oh, yeah.
fan of the books. He's read the books. He knows them inside and out. We've had some incredible creative discussions. I've even been to his gym. He and David Leitch own a gym where their choreography team that has worked on everything from The Crow to the Marvel movies to Deadpool, Wolverine, and they're all Ledger fans. So they're we're going to make the announcement tomorrow that Ledger is being developed for television, and with a guy who gets it.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to focus on the big, issues. Yeah, there'll be a big threat in each episode or each season, but he really wants to drill down into character development. What makes Joe Joe?
Mhm.
And his, when he was just telling me his take on it, it was exactly what I would want for television, with respect
Awesome.
for the characters. It would be set in the DMS era, not the RTI era. So he likes the character of Doctor Who as opposed. He likes Doc Holliday, but he likes the Joe's interaction with William Who. And we would put Ghost in there from the very beginning, even though we would start with the Patient Zero story. Ghost would be in there sooner than he actually appears in the series. He doesn't come into book 3.
Will he have the titanium teeth?
Yeah, well, that's one of and Chad and I are both like huge dog guys and rescue dog guys too. So this will be a faithful adaptation of it, and I'll be an executive producer and involved in the creative process of it. But that news actually tomorrow, and I can't wait for that to hit, because there's a lot of wonderful. I love them all, Joe Ledger fans out there, and I think they'll be really happy. It's been optioned before, but it was optioned with versions of it that just didn't fit. Like there was one version of it where Joe and Rudy, like Rudy was female and they were lovers, and everything was in LA, and another version where the whole thing was built around one book, Extinction Machine, with the others not really being part of the story. And it's like, that isn't what I want. And Chad really gets it. So I'm very excited, and we'll be making the announcement probably tomorrow.
That'll hit like a bomb. Everybody will.
Yeah. Plus, think of Chad's work. I mean, he was the stunt double for Brandon Lee in the original Crow. And when Lee died, they CGI'd Lee's face over Chad's body. He was a stunt double for Keanu Reeves in The Matrix, and he's done everything. He's been involved in every major action franchise except Star Wars, I think. So he gets it, but he's also a humanist, and that really matters. So I think we're going to have a lot of fun making a Joe Ledger TV show.
Oh yeah. Well, let him take that and bring it to somebody who understands what he's selling as well. Not somebody that, not a network that's going to have too many notes.
Yeah, it's going to be a streaming service, and he would remain as producer, so he would be the chief executive on the show.
Good.
Cool. And also direct the pilot.
Cool.
With a lot of authors getting into the script writing and such, like we just saw Blake Crouch just did Dark Matter, which Apple did a great job, I believe, with that. Would you want to be a part of that? Actually,
yes,
hands-on in script?
Yes, I would definitely want to be a part of that, and would likely be a part of that. Not a showrunner. We're going to find a showrunner who has a really good reputation about for running great shows, but as somebody who's part of the creative team and writes an episode or two, absolutely. Might even get my own Alfred Hitchcock walk on.
Oh yes.
There's one plan for the Rotten Ruin movie, which is in development now too, because we're at the second draft of script, and we're edging closer to production, and Mia's Hawaiian shirt zombie is already in the works.
Oh, good.
Making your painting real.
Yeah.
Acting debut.
That's exciting. Wow. Yeah, bring it on. Bring it on.
Very exciting.
This has been great, guys. I'm going to dive back in. I'm writing the second Sleepers War book now, so I'm going to dive back in.
Yes, we're going to
space battle. So I got to go get the hell out of trouble.
We're gonna let you get your busy day done and taken care of, so you can go hang out with the dog for a while and enjoy a nice cup of Joe Ledger's whoop ass coffee. So.
Which I'm actually drinking at the moment.
See, I got that in there right at the end. So
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing the time with us and letting us completely geek out on
anytime.
all things
You guys are
Kagan.
always fun. So
Thank you.